All right, so thanks again for having us. I'm really excited to be here and talk about some of the work that I do as the Senior Associate for Policy and Advocacy at Education Reform Now in Washington, D.C. I am a 2009 graduate of the college with a major in foreign affairs and minor in anthropology. And then I was the second class of the Batten School in 2010. So really, really excited to be here. I know we've come a long way and we've grown so much. So it's great to connect with so many students and alums and faculty and other folks in the UVA network. A little bit about me. I'm from Virginia. I immigrated from Trinidad and Tobago actually when I was 7 years old, first generation college student. As I mentioned, was second class of Batten and then went on to do Teach for America in New Orleans. And I've been doing education policy and advocacy ever since. So a little bit about Education Reform Now. We are a think tank in Washington, D.C. We work on pre-K, K-12, and higher ed policy. Here on the slide kind of highlights our 5 core issue areas from resource equity to higher ed. We are all about ensuring that all students, especially our most vulnerable students, have access to a high quality public education. And we can talk a whole lot about each of the solutions that we have in our core policy areas, but today we're going to focus mainly on our higher ed piece and how institutions can be more committed to diversifying our campus and both on a socioeconomic level and racial diversity. And then with me here today also to help talk about this topic is someone who I think is a real expert on it, who's worked on this area for many, many years, both on the Hill and at the Department of Education. My colleague at Education Reform Now, Michael Dannenberg. So Michael, I'll kick it to you to give a little bit more background on who you are in your work.
Thanks, Dana. I've been doing education policy. Well, I started with Senator Pell, which gives you of Pell Grant fame, which gives you an idea of how far back I go. Senator Pell, Senator Kennedy. I've advised every Democratic nominee on education policy in the last, 4 cycles, and have done a variety of issues from K-12 to higher ed at the federal level, working in the judicial branch, the executive branch, legislative branch, as well as at outside groups like Education Reform Now. And on this particular issue, higher education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've got a history that stretches back to my days with Senator Kennedy and two key affirmative action cases back then, Grutter and Gratz, where I worked on defense of race-based affirmative action on behalf of Senator Kennedy, as well as more offensive work to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that cause endures, the work goes on. And as Senator Kennedy says, the dream never dies.
Thanks, Michael. So I mentioned ERN is we're a national organization. We have 8 state chapters as well, where we do a lot of advocacy for these same types of issues that are impacting students and families at the local and state level. My role at ERN is federal, 100%. Working with members of Congress, especially Democrats who are champions of these issues and trying to enact policies that will improve our sector. So that involves a lot of coalition work, as you can imagine. So one of the main pieces that we're working on, since COVID happened, the Higher Education Act was very much underway for reauthorization on the Hill, and that completely halted. So obviously COVID is now where the focus is on health, and especially for us on education funding to make sure that schools can operate and open safely, and that kids who are at home are learning online and have access to Wi-Fi and the like. One of the other pieces of our work is now to impact the next Congress, as well as the next administration if there's a change in administration. So what we've been working on in partnership with all of the groups that you see here and many others, is to come up with a very strong agenda that highlights the 5 core priorities that we talked about on the last slide, but really has the buy-in of a very diverse group of partners. So here you can see the National Action Network, you can see the National Urban League, you see Unidos US. These are some of the largest civil rights groups in the country. But you also see the National Center for Learning Disabilities, and then IDEA Public Schools. This is a charter network that operates in Texas and other parts of the country. So this is a pretty diverse span for those who are familiar with the way that DC and federal national organizations operate. And we've worked really hard since our inception to really grow these alliances and partnerships, and know that when it comes to advocacy, there's definitely power in numbers. So we've surely submitted our own recommendations for the next administration and members on the Hill, but this document is something that we're working on and actually launched yesterday publicly. So you can check it out online if you want. And that's very much in conjunction with some of the work that the Democratic Platform Drafting Committee, whose hearing is taking place right now, will be seeing and looking at when they're making their considerations for the platform for the party. So it's 10 recommendations from pre-K to higher ed. The one that we're going to drill down on today is number 8, which is the meaningful commitment to racial diversity and socioeconomic diversity. So before we jump in, we've got 2 quick questions, and this is not a test. So just answer, based off of how you feel, and then we'll do a post poll at the end of the presentation. The first question is, should legacy preference and admissions decisions be eliminated? Yes or no? And then number 2, should early decision be eliminated? Again, in admissions, yes or no? So we'll have like 30 seconds to vote, and then we'll see what the results are. Because hosts and panelists can't vote, so I tried. All right. So for number 1, it looks like the majority, 2/3, about think that legacy should be eliminated. On the early decision matter, that we have a flip where 3/4 of the group says that early decision should not be eliminated. So great. I'm really excited to see if that changes and how so at the end. Okay. So I think a lot of folks are familiar with UNC Chapel Hill, one of our peer institutions, as we like to call them, because they're similar in size. They're both public institutions, and they have a very similar sort of demographic when it comes to the types of students who go there, especially on the racial side. So we're going to compare UVA to UNC on some measures that we look at when it comes to how well institutions are really meaningfully committing to diversity. And those 3 categories are access, affordability, and completion. And when I talk about access, it's simply, what is the enrollment when it comes to different types of students, and what are the graduation rates on the completion side, and then obviously affordability, the cost of actually attending those institutions. So the first slide here kind of highlights, we'll start with completion. UVA is obviously orange, and UNC is baby blue. And these are the 4-year graduation rates by race. And there's a few categories that are excluded, Native and Native American. Pacific Islanders not on here, mainly because the numbers were so low that it was just taking up space on the chart without being visually enlightening, not because I just chose these these categories. So I want to make sure that I state that. And this all comes from the collegeresults.org website, which is a great resource. You can pull up all kinds of statistics on institutions and compare them as well. So you can see our numbers are really similar to UVA or to UNC in a lot of ways. We are a little bit more diverse when it comes to Asian students especially, but one thing I wanted to flag is these are, again, really general categories, right? So for Black students, this can include African-American students, it can include international students, it can include Caribbean students. Same with Latino. I think the countries and Asian, the countries where these students are actually coming from, there's massive variety of different things that are going on that can just sort of mask the way that these categories kind of appear. So go on to the next slide. So they're very similar when it comes to access, or completion, I should say, is the takeaway from this slide. Then on affordability gets a little bit different. So we have 4 categories here, looking at the first 2, in-state tuition and fees and total price for in-state on-campus students. This is basically what you would call sticker price, as Michael has taught me. This is the first category you can see is just tuition and fees. Then when you look at the actual total price, the main difference between the first set of columns and the second set of columns is housing, right? So when you add in housing, the cost pretty much doubles for UVA. And then when you look at housing and you add that in for UNC, it almost triples. So that's just a really interesting sort of note, and maybe why colleges are eager to get campuses open in the fall. It's not just about tuition, but also your housing fees. The second 2 categories, average net price after grants and average net price for low income students, are what Michael calls, or what folks call, out-of-pocket expenses. So these are full costs out of pocket, and a lot of times, folks who won't have this type of money out of pocket are taking out loans to pay for their college fees. And UVA is, clearly across the board more expensive than UNC when it comes to cost and affordability. And then the third category on access, thinking about how those other 2 categories play into access and the types of students who actually attend the university. Undergrads, Black, Latino, or comparable, Asian as well. But when you look at Pell students, UNC has a much, much, much higher rate of Pell enrolled students on their campus. And so Pell here, for those who aren't aware, is students coming from backgrounds that are making $60,000 or less at the household level. So this is low, middle income students. And then before I jump over there, I wanted to just kind of tie this all together and talk about the way that we look at diversity and our student campus, or our campus experience is it's not an uncomplicated factor, right? You have to look at race, you have to look at income, you have to look at all the different pieces that goes into what makes, really robust and well-rounded learning experience for students. I went to UVA, obviously. I stuck around for grad school and I really enjoyed my time there. I also majored in foreign affairs, and the majority of my classes were taught by professors of color because I focused on Africa and the Caribbean. The students in my classes were very diverse because of my majors. And I just had a very specific set of experiences at UVA because of what I was studying. And I think, we'll go into what all it takes when a student steps foot on campus and says, this is the place for me. But I think we've done a lot of great things and we have more work ahead of us. So I'll kick it now to Michael to talk more about the recommendations. First, for socioeconomic mobility specifically, and then he'll talk more about ways to diversify on a racial level.
Thanks, Dana. There are a few points I want to add to Dana's rundown of UVA versus UNC. The first is when she mentioned peer institutions. they're peer institutions not only in size and that they're both public institutions, but basically they have the same median SAT scores and median high school GPA of incoming students. So their admission standards are quite similar. And as Dana said, UVA does a little better on completion, but in general, they're both very, very good on completion. UNC is much more affordable for low-income students, and UNC does a much better job in letting in low-income students, that is Pell Grant eligible students who are typically, as Dana said, from families of $60,000 a year in income or less. UVA typically ranks as the worst or second worst public college university in the country when it comes to low-income student enrollment. They vie with University of Wisconsin. I suggested to Dana that if you wanted to make UVA feel better, we could put Notre Dame on here. They're terrible on access as well, but they're, of course, a private institution. The other big comparison I want to...
There's a name for that, right? Because I remember going to the college results website and there was a little exclamation mark next to that figure, and it called it out. So UVA is an institution of inequity or something like that.
It's my name, and it's an engine of inequality is a term that we coined when I was at the Education Trust, and now is used pretty widely in the field. The second big comparison I want to note is that UVA is substantially more wealthy than UNC Chapel Hill. UVA's endowment now is at about $9.6 billion. That's about 2 times the size of UNC Chapel Hill. So UNC Chapel Hill is cheaper, they enroll more low-income students, and they have half as much money to do it. Then also mentioned the college results online website, which I highly recommend. All the data on that website comes from the US Department of Education, which gets its data from that which the colleges submit themselves. So the data is pretty rock solid because it comes from the colleges. And then last, when we talk about meaningful commitment to diversity, the point here is that a lot of schools do a good job of talking a good game when it comes to diversity, and they may be aggressive on admissions with things like race-based affirmative action or recruitment or whatever, but there's sort of 2 ends to the spectrum. There's getting people through the admissions door, and then there's getting them past the graduation stage. UVA is good on the latter, not so good on the former. With respect to socioeconomic mobility and making things more affordable, there was a UVA grad who I used to work with about 10 years ago, who spotlighted that UVA, which used to have a no loan policy for low-income students, decided to reverse that policy and start instituting loans to students from very, very low-income families. Not just $60,000 a year and less, but $30,000 a year or less. They said that they were doing it to save about $6 million in financial aid expenses. That same year, they spent $12 million on a new squash center. Mary Newham Barry, that recent graduate, wrote an op-ed that I think appeared in the Washington Post, sort of expressing her outrage. And before you knew it, students, alumni, faculty, and staff started working on a campaign to increase need-based financial aid. That campaign was called Restore Access UVA, and ended up being somewhat successful in that UVA made an increased commitment to need-based aid going forward from where it was, but it did not restore its no loan policy. That's relevant with respect to access because students from very low income families, even if you're going to UVA and it's a great deal and your chances of success are extremely high, there's a high degree of debt aversion, particularly from students from low-income families, and frankly, the research says from certain racial subgroups. So the choice to have a loan policy affects access. One of the things UVA could do is increase its need-based aid and go away from loans to a no debt or no loan guarantee. UNC Chapel Hill has that. It's called the Carolina Covenant. There are at least 40 odd colleges and universities in the country that have a similar no debt policy. And of course, nationally, there's been a movement to try and pursue what are called promise campaigns so that students are guaranteed a debt-free ride. Too often, I think colleges and universities sort of try and go for the marketing of that on the cheap. So they say, well, we'll do no loans for tuition and fees. But as Dana pointed out, that's half the cost at a UVA or a third of the cost at UNC. When we pointed out to the University of Wisconsin and the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that it was now the worst college in the country when it came to low-income student access, the response from the president was, oh, we've got the Bucky promise, where we have no debt for low-income students. Well, what they didn't say was it was only for tuition. It's only for tuition and fees. And that's a great policy because to have a no debt policy overall beyond tuition and fees because of debt aversion, but it's only good if you're actually letting in students in the first place, which goes to some of the admissions policies that Dana highlighted to open this presentation, things like legacy preferences, early decision, and so forth. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes, and we actually have a question really quick. Would you like to take it now? It's on endowments, or should we leave it to the end?
Okay. It looks like this is from Emily Barkstow, saying that name correctly. I don't know how these work in practice. I've seen them mentioned a lot in recent conversations around the university. Is there a way for UVA to use our endowment to be more inclusive and or increase access and affordability? Well, typically what happens when folks point to super wealthy institutions, and just to be clear, UVA is a super wealthy institution with a $9.6 billion endowment. It ranks easily in the top 50 in the country. The universities say, oh, our hands are tied when it comes to our endowment. You know, that money is dedicated to specific purposes. Well, first of all, that's true with respect to some endowment funds, but not all endowment funds. UVA's endowment in 2017, to give you a sense of perspective, was $5.7 billion. In 2020, it was $9.6 billion. That's a massive amount of growth. Moreover, UVA reports that its spend out rate, the percentage of its endowment that it spends out each year, is 4.7%. Now, to be clear here, nationwide, all foundations, nonprofit charitable organizations, the Gates Foundation, Hewlett Packard, they are required by tax law to spend out 5% of their endowment every year or they lose their tax status. There's an exception, however, when it comes to universities. They don't have to do that. So that 4.7% versus 5%, that might not sound like much, right? But if you do the math, 0.3%, a $9.6 billion endowment works out to about $28 to $30 million a year. To give you a sense of perspective, at the cost of UVA, that's enough to double your Pell enrollment and have those students pay nothing. So there is ample room to increase spending. And there are a number of institutions, colleges, and universities that spend more than 4.7%, spend more than 5%, spend as much as 7%. So there is room when it comes to the university wealth. And of course, the university's wealth is not simply the endowment. It also comes from tuition and fees and room and board. A dirty little secret is that universities engage in effectively social engineering or I guess we could call it price discrimination for the economists on the call, where they charge some students more and other students less. And basically they're shifting money from high pay students to lesser pay students. But universities want fewer lesser pay students so they can bring in more revenue. Part of the reason why UVA has such a low percentage of Pell students. I mentioned access in terms of letting students in on admissions. UVA is better than, frankly, a lot of the most elite colleges in the country. The dirty little secret is that the early decision system fills about 40% of slots at elite institutions in the country. 40% of slots are taken. At UVA, it's a mere 21%. Legacies are another 11% at UVA. Now, of course, there's some overlap. But when you add up, the 21% who are getting in through early decision, early action, early decision, the 11% who are getting in as a legacy preference, your number of slots is diminishing markedly. And make no mistake, the advantages associated with these policies are significant for applicants. The research indicates that for early decision students, applying early is worth about 100 extra points on your SAT. Being a legacy is worth about 160 points on your SAT. Those who are early decision are 3.5 times more likely to be white than the regular decision admittees, applicants and admittees. And part of the reason for this is because those who come from working class backgrounds or racial minority backgrounds, disproportionately, A, they don't know about early decision policy. B, if they do know about it, they can't really execute it because, as you know, with binding early decision, you commit to an institution regardless of what your financial aid package will be. Well, working class students need to compare financial aid packages and go to the cheapest place possible. Now, it's far more pernicious, it's far more significant in its impact on admissions than the legacy preference because it's twice as large at UVA and it's three times as large probably nationally at elite colleges as the legacy preference. But in many ways, the legacy preference is more pernicious. At least everyone can apply theoretically early decision. Legacy preference is a right of birth. There was a time when universities were moving away from early decision. UNC Chapel Hill, Stanford, I believe even UVA got rid of binding early decision in like the early 2000s, around 2004. And then they brought it back. You can ask them why they brought it back, but it is without question a policy that drives inequity on campus. Legacy preferences have not gone away. There are a number of institutions that have been going away from them that are of note: Texas A&M, University of Chicago. We see it in the California system. And what's interesting there is people say, well, that could affect fundraising because that's why donors give. At those places, donations have actually gone up. Now, that doesn't mean they wouldn't have gone up more, but again, sort of come back to this idea of the morality of legacy preference. Like, if you're really using admissions for the purposes of raising contributions, you might as well just auction off acceptance letters on eBay, right? That would be more efficient and more effective than a legacy preference. You'd raise more money and be open to more people. So our thinking is that both of these policies should be eliminated nationwide. The federal government provides over $150 billion a year in grant aid and tax benefits to institutions in the form of just student aid and student loans and tax deductions for tuition and such. That's to say nothing of things like tax exempt status. But secondly, our thinking is that this is only going to happen at individual campuses or nationally with pressure, that institutions rarely reform themselves. We saw that with getting rid of UVA's no loan policy and pulling back on need-based aid. It wasn't until the Restore Access UVA campaign where students pushed back and the community pushed back on the reduction in financial aid that the university responded by increasing its commitment to need-based aid. The same holds for access and enrollment of students from low income, I would argue racial minority backgrounds as well, that it only is going to come from outside pressure. There are two forms of outside pressure I want to highlight. One is something called the Aspire Act. This is pending in Congress right now. It was introduced by Chris Coons in the Senate, Democrat from Delaware. Former Senator Johnny Isakson from Georgia is no longer in the Senate. It's now sponsored by Jackie Rosen. For those, what it essentially would do is say to colleges and universities that are in the bottom 5% of the country when it comes to low-income student enrollment, which, by the way, UVA is, that if you don't improve, then we're going to charge, we, the taxpayers, are going to charge you a fee, a public service fee, to participate in the federal student loan programs, which are a big benefit to institutions. And we're going to take that money and we're going to give it to the schools that are letting in low-income students, but are struggling. So in essence, it would be sort of the UVAs of the world providing funds to struggling HBCUs in Virginia and other high access colleges that are struggling. So that's option number one. And for those who want to advance that, Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia sits on the Education Committee. Bobby Scott, Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia, is the chairman of the Education Committee in the House of Representatives. They obviously would be more receptive to constituents than other groups, and there's an argument to push for that. But then there's also an argument in terms of campus action. Georgetown students, I think last week, started a petition to eliminate the legacy preference. Within the first 12 hours, there were about 300 signatures that I saw. I haven't looked at it since. But the point is that institutions are notoriously, institution leaders, sensitive to criticism from their students, from their alumni, from donors, from the community. That's what the Restore Access UVA campaign did. And like I said, it was very successful. I think the university ended up pumping in another $10 million immediately into financial aid. And I think the same thing could occur on campus now with respect to admissions policies. And really what's even more important than admissions policies is sort of the bottom line. Because you can get rid of legacy preference, you can get rid of early decision, but if you're still only enrolling 10% of students from families with incomes of $60,000 a year or less, then you're not really living up to Thomas Jefferson's idea of what the University of Virginia should be. And then I guess I sort of return it back.
Now, to invoke our founder's name. I'm just kidding.
I turn it back to Dana on sort of inclusive and safe learning environment for all students because she has more experience, obviously, at the University of Virginia than I do. But there's a lot more that goes into a meaningful commitment to diversity than simply access, affordability, and completion. It's also the environment on campus.
100%. Yep, and I think I was just one of the lucky ones who was exposed to UVA in all of the best ways when I came down to visit. I think it was with a group of diverse students that was through a program out of my high school. We had a wonderful tour guide, it just was a great experience from the beginning. And then I actually I failed to mention, offered one of the 50 University Achievement Award scholarships. That's a merit-based economic, as your economic status and your diversity. There's a few different, categories that you have to meet, like 3 or 4 out of the 10. So I was able to get a full ride to UVA. And that really helped my family in ways that I think we would have made it work through loans. But my loans which I think finally got paid off couple of years ago, were much, much smaller. And that allowed me to, be more engaged in a variety of activities on grounds. I did work several years while I was at UVA, but it wasn't out of necessity as much as it would have been prior to getting that scholarship. But again, that was 50 out of the incoming class of like 10,000 students, right? I also, I think was able to take part in all of the different things that was available to students. But the point is there's not enough of that. And I've talked to a lot of my peers who went to UVA and people thinking about going to UVA since. I'm very, very proud of UVA, but there's also a lot that we can do. I think the fact that we just finally had the monument dedicated to the enslaved people who built the university installed this year or last year is just vastly too late in terms of when that could have happened earlier. There are so many instances of, racial issues that happened while I was on campus that I think has gotten potentially worse at times since I left. Obviously, last August was it last August? Several Augusts ago, we've been through a lot as a community in Charlottesville and as a campus. And I was encouraged by what the university came up with for the bicentennial celebration. That just made me leave feeling fulfilled and very excited about the future. But that was one incident, right? It needs to be backed up when it comes to policies and our commitment to really diversifying. And I was telling Michael, we're talking about some of these policies at the end of the day. If you are a student and you walk onto those grounds and you don't feel welcome, because you can sometimes feel the wealth, right? The average income of a UVA student compared to a UNC student is vastly, vastly different. I remember not just, I was from Northern Virginia, but not just feeling culture shock in a Southern, Northern kind of sense, but in a wealth sense. You know, I was from a pretty affluent high school, but the wealth at UVA in certain, you know, circles and Greek life especially, which I was part of, is a whole nother thing when people are asking, where do you summer? I'm like, what does that even mean? And so I think those are the types of things that are much harder to tackle, but it should be part of the conversation that administrators and, the dean and others who are on the task force to deal with these issues should be considering. And the best way to do that is really to survey students and get their input, both those who choose to stay and join, attend UVA, and those who decide to take the tour and then pick another institution. It'd be hard for me to say I would do things exactly the same as I did when I was picking my institution. I think UVA worked out for me in a lot of ways, but I always wonder, what if I had gone to an HBCU or a more diverse school where folks looked like me, and I wasn't the only person really in a lot of my classes and the rooms at UVA who had my background. But that's sort of an anecdotal piece. I would love to hear more in the Q&A section and just later on from folks about what your thoughts are on how we can tackle that issue. But there is a related question from an anonymous person that ties into this. And it says, the UVA's admission rate for Black students is not terrible, but its yield rate is lower than many peers. Do you think this is due to high relative financial cost or disproportionately high psychological cost? Michael, is that something you want to tackle, or? I think it's a great question.
Thanks a lot, Dana. Why Black students who are admitted to UVA choose not to attend. I imagine it's a mix of both financial considerations as well as the feel of the institution. I think that's sort of more interesting is the premise of the question, which is that UVA has a not terrible rate when it comes to admission of Black students. My guess is that that's sort of looking at its peers. And what I see year after year from elite colleges is a very consistent level of enrollment of students who identify as Black. A little different than admissions because it's enrollment. But year after year, it's like 5.8% at the top schools. And it sort of begs the question of why isn't it higher? The same holds for low-income students. When you look at the ACT, for example, and just as a marker, students who score in the 90th percentile and higher on the ACT, 1 in 5 of them comes from a Pell-eligible background, meaning they have a family income of less than $60,000. Why does UVA or any top college have less than 20% of low-income students, given that you've got these high test scores on just the ACT and SAT, which have all kinds of arguments against them in terms of bias and so forth, never mind not taking into consideration contextual issues. It seems like it should be much, much higher. And I think the same holds for Black students. If elite institutions, if UVA recruited Black students overall and low-income students, the way it recruits football players and basketball players, you can be damn sure these numbers would be a hell of a lot higher than they are, irrespective of the yield.
I hope that answers that question for that individual, but I think it's a complex question and one that we really should think about. I know that in more recent years, I have found that coming back for Black Alumni Weekend reunion has been more beneficial and fun than our regular reunion. And I wonder, why do we have the separate ones? I know why, but when we have them separately, we just have, people pick and choose which one they want to come to. It worked out for me that the Batten reunion was the same as Black Alumni Weekend last year. But it's something that I think colleges have done. Michael, do you know any specific examples of institutions that have been very intentional about recruiting students from diverse backgrounds. And can you maybe give a good example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I do with respect to Black, Latino. I do know it with respect to low-income students.
Mm-hmm.
I think a really good example is Franklin and Marshall, which is in Pennsylvania. It's a private college. It used to be one of the worst in the country when it came to Pell enrollment. Um, the, the president of that institution, Dan Porterfield, and the chairman, the board of trustees, made a commitment to boost their enrollment of low-income students. And they engaged in all kinds of outreach efforts. They changed their recruitment patterns. Right now, a lot of universities, when they send out admissions officers on recruitment visits, they target specific areas of the country, and those tend to be areas where they're likely to get a lot of high-pay students. They boosted their need-based financial aid. They partnered with local high schools. They partnered with local community colleges, which tend to be a very good feeder of low-income and racial minority students. Now I don't know much about the details of the Virginia system. My understanding is UVA and Nova have a great relationship, and where there's transfer of credits. I don't know if that extends statewide, because at Nova, you're less likely to have as heavy a minority and low-income student population at that community college as you are at, say, at Virginia Beach. But there are a series of efforts that I've seen that have been successful. And they go from everything from recruitment to altered admissions policies, getting rid of binding early decision for starters, class-based affirmative action, which has been recommended by the former president of Harvard and Princeton, where just as we put on a thumb on the scale for racial minorities, you do the same thing for low-income students. Partnerships with local school districts, partnerships with local community colleges. All of those things end up having the effect of boosting racial minority and low-income student enrollment. And at Franklin and Marshall, what they report is, that's not just a socially responsible thing to do. It makes for a better campus and a better educational experience for the students there. Right? This is the dirty little secret of affirmative action and diversity and so forth. It's not just a matter of corrective justice and doing what's right. It benefits everyone on the campus. And the faculty report that they have better students, and the students report that they have a better experience.
We have time for one or two last questions. And we got some really good ones in the last few minutes. I think what folks are asking from the chat broadly is just a lot of administrators want to know what at the administrative level, and including Batten's dean, Dean Solomon, who's on UVA's racial equity task force, what are the top 3 priorities that we would recommend to the president and the board of visitors? And I think I would say first and foremost, end legacy preference in admissions. I'm a big supporter of the university, and it's always been hard. So because I got the University Achievement Award, want to make sure my contributions are going to that particular program. And on all of our cards that we get, there's never a specific box. So I have to often call Alumni Hall and say, how do I make sure my money's going to Access UVA and the University Achievement Award, especially, or for first gen students? And there's a lot of writing in. And I think folks would just feel like, one, the university's prioritizing those students if they're actually called out and labeled on these, donation cards, as well as on the website online, to be able to have that specific category the same way there is for legacy. And it does make me wonder. I know how large our endowment is. I know that we're giving scholarships, not just preference, but scholarships to students who are legacy. And I think finding transparency and how those numbers are allocated would be helpful to folks like me and a lot of other alums who want to donate. Michael talked about the fact that some of the institutions that got rid of legacy, their donations actually went up after that. I would not be surprised if the same thing happened at UVA. So one, get rid of legacy preference. It's just completely outdated. Our institution, as we know, was not open to women until 1969. Obviously, Black people, other ethnicities for you know, a very long time after. So we think about who are the legacy students and, you know, what are their backgrounds and why this is really something that needs to exist in 2020. The second piece, which we talked about, is early decision. And that was where the poll was a little bit flipped. I would love to see after this conversation what the poll is. So maybe we'll quickly do that before folks hop off, just so we can see if there was a shift or not. And then knowing that it's going to take pressure from students and you know, alums and the like, but really folks in leadership to look at this and see who it's benefiting. And I know that it was reinstated, I believe, last year, right after President Ryan came in. And so it might be something that might be a little bit more political for us to engage in, but it's, in our opinion, the right thing to do. And Michael, what would you say would be your third, if you had to give them a third recommendation?
I certainly agree with legacy and all early admissions policy, early action and early decision. But I think it would be pretty impactful if the president of UVA basically wrote a letter to the chairman of the education committee from Virginia, Bobby Scott, and to Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, and said, look, we support this idea of colleges being pushed to improve on student body diversity and for there to be accountability for in terms of consequences. The president of Princeton, I believe, did that and then quickly kind of walked it back. But it was very, very notable when the president of Princeton did that. I think the president of UVA could do that. That would be a real statement of leadership saying, look, we know we have a problem. We're going to work on it over the course of the next few years, and we're willing to hold ourselves accountable for it. And maybe the steps include early decision, legacy preferences, but that's not enough because ultimately it's outcomes that matter.
And we have legislation that we're happy to share, the Aspire Act that Michael mentioned, that I think if someone like President Ryan or a leader at an institution like UVA could have the quote unquote political courage, as we talk about our elected officials in Congress needing more of these days, to say, you know, we would be hit by this in the beginning because our numbers are low. They are lower than they should be for students of color and for Pell eligible students. But the bill also has these structures where you have a certain amount of time to improve, to put into place different policies that would force the institution essentially to be more intentional when it comes to recruiting diverse students and all of the like. And, you know, we could eventually no longer be in that danger zone category and be an example for other institutions. But first it takes someone, right, to have the courage to say that, you know, this is something that we care enough about that we would maybe lose a little bit of financial resources from it in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if I were I forgot Jim Ryan's the president. I keep thinking of Sullivan. I mean, this is a
Harvard Graduate School of Education. Yep.
The guy who's got a pretty big education background substantively. But, you know, I could see Ryan doing a joint letter with Michael Drake, who's the new chancellor of the UC system and who believes in this, and that being extremely impactful. You know, leadership can come from the outside in terms of student pressure on institutions, and it can come from the inside in terms of changes, and it can come from the inside to the outside in terms of legislative action.
Millie, do you want to do the poll really quick? Awesome. So we'll wrap up. Should legacy be eliminated? Yes or no? And should early decision be eliminated? 30 seconds. All right, woo woo. That's what I like to see. The change is real. So I'm pretty sure both went up significantly, but obviously the latter, where there was more disagreement on early decision, 86% now, and we have less voters I see as well. But the folks who stayed with us, believe that early decision too is more similar to legacy in terms of its inequity for the students that we talked about. So I think we'll end there. We're past time, but I'm sure that Batten will share our contact information. Shameless plug from that first slide, but you can follow us at education. I think it's Ed Reform Now USA on Twitter, and check out our website, sign up for our newsletters, and that way you'll be able to stay in the loop on all the work that we're doing here at the federal level. So thanks so much, and would love to be back at some point to talk more about, schools reopening and their COVID plans and all of that fun stuff.